Welcome to the Ideas on Stage podcast, your regular insight into leadership communication.
Hey Todd, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Andrea. Great to be here with you.
Thank you very much. I'm super excited about our conversation today. And the reason why I wanted to have a chat with you is because you need to know, Todd, that my passion for presentations and public speaking, and also your area of expertise, which is visual communication, started about 10 years ago when I first read Presentation Zen by Gar Reynolds.
Mm-hmm.
And that book is about presentation design, but I would say that it's more than that. I would say that it's really a book about visual communication. How do we use the power of visuals to better communicate? And I think that what you do and your work, and also your recent book, Visual Leadership, is great. And it's very much connected to also what we do with our clients as presentation coaches. And so I'm super excited, and thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure. Yeah, Gar Reynolds, there are two people with the greatest influence on my thinking. One was Gar Reynolds and the other was Nancy Duarte. The two of them, I call them the king and queen of visual communication, because between Presentation Zen and Slideology, Nancy Duarte's book, those two completely changed the way I presented, thought. So like you said, it's not just how to create better slides. It really is about thinking differently about how you get a message across. And it's not just up on stage, but it's really in any context, right?
Absolutely. And also for me, Gar Reynolds, Nancy Duarte, so same influencers. And that's why I saw that there was a very strong connection. So that's what we're going to talk about today: visual thinking, visual communication, and of course later as well, visual leadership. So what are we talking about? What is it? What is visual thinking, Todd?
Well, in a nutshell, which is a metaphor, by the way, something we'll be talking about, so not a literal nutshell, but visual thinking is basically about thinking in pictures, right, as opposed to words or numbers. So often as business professionals, we need to get ideas across, and we overload people with words, just too many words, and especially up on the screen, too much text up on the screen. There's that death by bullet point thing, right? So it becomes your script or your teleprompter instead of a supporting vehicle. And same thing with numbers. Business professionals, there's so much data. I teach in the HR master's program at NYU, and in human resources, a lot of numbers to deliver, right? But people bore, and financial service, whatever area you work in, there's always numbers, but people just bore people to death with numbers and statistics and data instead of thinking about the fact that, I always say that the numbers are meaningless outside of the context and outside of the story you're trying to tell, right? So numbers are just numbers. So how do you get to the story behind it so people are engaged and there's meaning there?
Yeah, and actually, because you mentioned numbers, I read an article that you wrote some time ago. I think it was on your LinkedIn profile, and sorry, but it made me laugh. The title made me laugh. Or maybe it was a chapter of your book. I don't remember now, but it said, and I have it here, how my cardiologist almost gave me a heart attack.
Yes.
And it made me laugh. And you were talking about the right and wrong way to communicate numbers. Yeah. So tell us more about this.
Sure.
What's the right and wrong way to communicate numbers?
Yeah, the wrong way is if you're communicating numbers that scares the recipient to death. That's the wrong way. So basically, that's a chapter of my book, and it was also a blog post as well. So how my cardiologist almost gave me a heart attack. I was going for some routine physical, and I'm over 50, so you have to go through all the heart tests and everything. And the cardiologist, instead of my regular cardiologist, some young guy cardiologist came out, and you could tell he wasn't that experienced. And he said, "Oh, well, looking at your numbers, based on your results, you have a 5% chance of having a heart attack within the next 10 years. And I literally, my knees started shaking, my heart started pounding, I thought I was going to pass out. And I stopped for a second. I said, wait a minute, doesn't that mean that there's a 95% chance that I won't have a heart attack within the next 10 years? He said, yeah, that's another way of looking at it. And I was like, yeah, I think so. So he was delivering accurate information, right? But was that really the message he wanted to convey? I don't think so, right? So, because basically, as it turned out, those numbers were statistically normal for anyone of my age group, right? So, so that's an example of how you communicated numbers. He wasn't wrong, but was he right? Right? And other classic examples are Steve Jobs. I don't know if you've ever read the Carmine Gallo book, The Presentation Secrets of Steve Jobs, but he has a great video as well. And he talks about how Steve Jobs, instead of saying, when he introduced the iPod, this little device holds 5 gigabytes of data. He said this holds 1,000 songs in your pocket, right? Unless, if you're not a technology person, who cares, who even knows what a gig is, right? Yeah. But if you say I can carry my whole CD collection around with me in my pocket wherever I go, that's amazing, right? So we always need to be thinking about, as presenters, as communicators, what's the message we want to convey, and not get caught up in the numbers, but get caught up in the message behind the numbers.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. The mistake we see so often with especially business professionals and also business leaders is that they assume that data and numbers are intrinsically meaningful. They just, that's my number, take it, understand it, it's important, use it, remember it. But that's not how our mind or how our brain works. So what matters is, as you said, the story and the message behind the numbers.
Right. And the larger a number is, the more abstract it becomes, right? And then it really becomes meaningless. So like another example of how I use visuals to illustrate this, in the United States, unfortunately, the statistic is that 3 out of 10 or 30% of high school students don't graduate on time from high school, right? So if you just put up that number and statistics and a graph, it just gets lost in the clutter. But if you show a picture of 10 high school kids, and then say of these 10 kids, 3 of them won't graduate, and you dissolve them or you disappear, or you say to the audience, which of the 3 will it be? All of a sudden, it's like, well, that could be my child, my niece, my nephew, my neighbor, right? Then that number, 3 out of 10 or 30%, which is abstract, it's like, oh, that's too bad. When it becomes actually children, then it has meaning. Then you have the human element, the emotional component behind the numbers. I think that's where a lot of business professionals miss out. You miss the human element of what the numbers represent.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings me to another point, which is, and this actually, this very example shows the part and how impactful visuals can be. And so why is it, what is it with visuals and imagery that makes it so effective and so impactful when it comes to communication, Todd?
Yeah, there's 2 ways of explaining it, and one way I won't go into because it's too scientific beyond my understanding, right? So there's all kind of brain science research that shows that our brains are just wired for visual imagery. From a child who looks up at their parents for the first time and makes that human connection through their eyes, the way our brains are wired to, if you show someone text and visual side by side, it's almost like your eyes are going to be magnetic and your brain is going to be magnetically pulled towards the visuals. It's just, that's the way so if you're presenting and if you have tons of text up on your screen, people don't know where to look. They get confused because half their brain wants to look at the text and read ahead, and the other half wants to look at you, right? So you're doing battle with your slides when you do that. So, but the way I sum it up in a really practical way, and I talk about this in my TEDx talk on the power of visual thinking, is I use 3 words: attention, comprehension, and retention. Attention, when you use visuals, and it's not just images, it's also visual language. When you use visuals, it captures people's attention. It gets them to focus. So if I'm showing you something, I say, Andrea, look at this. You're looking at it. You're not checking your phone. You're not doing something else, right? So you're focused visually. Secondly, comprehension, it increases understanding. If I show you something, you look at it and say, okay, now I know what you're talking about. You're based in London, right?
Yes.
And I'm based in New York. So if you were coming to New York, I hope you will someday to visit us. But if I explain to you how to get to my apartment from JFK Airport, if I say you go here, you make a left, you make a right, you're not going to remember that. But if I send you a map, you're going to have that map. You're going to look at it and you're going to say, oh, here's the airport, here's where you live. And then you could use that as a guide, right? So it increases your comprehension, your understanding. And thirdly is retention. So it's attention, comprehension, and retention. Retention is about memory and recall. If I show you something visually or use visual language, you're just going to remember it better than if you just took in the information auditorially through your ears. So that's why, in a nutshell, again, why visuals are so impactful, because they increase your understanding, your focus, understanding, and memory.
Yeah, absolutely. And to me, I don't know about you, Todd, with your experience, it's so sad to, in the end, still, despite the fact that what you've just said, and also despite the fact that if you look at what science knows about communication, about how brain works, and what that means when it comes to effective communication, despite that, still 99% of, in my work presentations, include lots of text and bullet points. A lot of business professionals, most business professionals still don't understand that people can't read and listen at the same time, or maybe they do, but because they've always done things in a certain way, they find it very hard to change.
Yeah, there's a few reasons. One, that's the way we've always done it, right? Two, when you think, you jot stuff down, you start to put your notes down into slides, but instead of, and Gar Reynolds and Nancy Duarte both talk about that, getting your ideas down in analog before going digital and creating your slides, right? So it's so easy for people just to pull up a blank template, type out their notes and say, okay, I'm ready. Because a lot of times you wait till the last minute. And you don't do the next step, which is creating the images and really, doing a good job with your slides. So I think there's a lot of reasons, but one is that people rush and they wait till the last minute. The other is that some of them don't realize it and others just don't know how. But sometimes I'll say to someone, would you have wanted to sit through the presentation you just gave? And a lot of people say no. I'm like, then why are you torturing everyone else? Why are you using PowerPoint as a torture device as opposed to, an educational tool? Right, so
definitely a torture device sometimes. And because before, Todd, you mentioned it's not just visuals, it's also visual language.
Yes.
And that reminded me of another great article I found on your LinkedIn profile. And again, I have it here. The title is Why Martin Luther King is the King of Visual Communication. Now, what do you mean by that? In the end, Martin Luther King, I do know what you mean, but for our listeners, in the end, he was not using PowerPoint, he was not showing any images, but still you say that he was the king of visual communication. Could you please explain?
Sure. I mean, that speech is, if not the greatest, it's one of the greatest speeches of all time. So in the United States, every January on his birthday, we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and I always watch it. What's interesting is sometimes I will read the text, just read it. Other times I will just listen to it, and other times I'll read it and watch it and listen to it at the same time. And what does he do? It's everything from his facial expression and his body language to his amazing use of language, his use of imagery, his use of alliteration, his language is poetic, right? Also, Nancy Duarte does an amazing job, and I think it's in Resonate where she dissects his entire speech with the spark line and the ups and downs and everything else.
What is what could be, what is what could be.
Exactly. So, but basically what visual leadership, which we'll talk about later, it's about using visual thinking, visual communication, visual language to paint a picture of the future, right? And that's exactly what he did. He didn't say, I have a business plan, I have an Excel spreadsheet, I have, he painted a picture. He basically created a vision, and that's what leadership is about, right? Having a vision and communicating that compelling vision in a way that gets other people on board with it. But it's the language that he uses and the body language and his voice and everything else that he does that creates a picture of a better future, a future that's different from and better than the current reality, and basically says, yeah, this is where we are, this is where we could be. And that's why I call him the king of visual communication, because again, without slides, without visual imagery, he created the language he uses when he talks about from the mountains of this place to the shores of this place, and you actually visualize the map. And I actually wrote a blog post about that Nancy Duarte posted on her site, which was really nice, and that was an honor because and she also wrote a blurb for my book as well. So yeah, she's someone who I respect so much and I learned so much from. But it hit me years ago, even before I discovered Nancy Duarte, that Martin Luther King Jr. I have a dream speech. We all know it. And again, it's I have a dream. It's not I have an Excel spreadsheet. I have a PowerPoint presentation to show you, right?
Yeah, and also Todd, and this is something that definitely Martin Luther King Jr. does, and also you often talk about the power of metaphors, and you also mentioned it before, analogies and stories, and of course then visual metaphors, visual analogies, visual stories. Again, could you expand on that?
Sure. Metaphor, just so you know, a lot of people think I have a business background because I teach management leadership at NYU and Columbia. I'm a leadership management consultant and leadership development professional and presentation skills coach. But my background is in English literature. So I grew up reading poetry. I got hooked on Shakespeare. I got addicted to Shakespeare when I was in high school due to Mr. Patterson, an amazing teacher who just taught Julius Caesar in a way that just it resonated with me, and I got so hooked. And I continued to read. My claim to fame in high school, showing what a big nerd I was, I read Romeo and Juliet, I didn't really know what I was reading. Julius Caesar, Mr. Patterson made it real. And then I read Macbeth and Hamlet and King Lear, and I kept going. So I read the complete works of Shakespeare by the time I was 18, before I graduated from high school. So all 37 plays, 154 sonnets. So that language of Shakespeare, whether you're watching a play or listening to an audio of it or reading it, the visual language of Shakespeare is just, in terms of metaphor and poetry of language and everything else. So that's where I really got hooked. And I was also, the other side of me was the television side. I got hooked on television as a young age, as many of us did. And I was obsessed with Superman and Batman and TV shows and comic book heroes like that. But the thing behind both of them is they're a metaphor. Superman is a metaphor, Batman's a metaphor. Metaphors are taking an idea and using it to explain something unlike it to make it clear to resonate with someone else. So you're making the complex simple. You're making the abstract concrete. You're making the invisible visible. You're making the unfamiliar familiar. The key with metaphor, like if the poet Robert Burns wrote, "My love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June," right? If you know what a rose looks like, and that little bud that's in June that's about to blossom, that's a great description of what love at its early stages is like, right? It's just like you planted the seed for it. It's just about to blossom, but it hasn't reached that full bloom yet, right? So just the power of metaphor is just hearing that. You're picturing it in your mind's eye, I bet, right now, right? The red, red rose, but I'm not showing you one, right? But you could see it, right? Wordsworth wrote the poem The Daffodils. He wrote about when he's on his couch, they flash upon his inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils, right? So he coined the term emotion recollected in tranquility. He could be on his couch, and yet by picturing those daffodils in his mind's eye, a term coined by Shakespeare in Hamlet, right? When Hamlet didn't know if the ghost was his real father or an apparition or a figment of his imagination. So we see it in our mind's eye. We experience the emotions as if we're seeing it with our physical eye. I think that's the magic of using metaphor and visual language when you're presenting. Can you bring people along on this journey with you, which is a metaphor, right? And have them experience it emotionally so it resonates with them. So long story short, that's the power and the value of metaphor. But one point I want to make is if you use a metaphor that someone understands and can relate to, it's very powerful. But if you use a wrong choice of metaphor, it won't. Like, I'm a very big baseball fan, but I know you're in London, you may not like or appreciate and know that much about baseball. So if I use baseball to explain something, you might be more confused instead of less confused, right? Yeah. So I may want to use football. Andy Lapata really clarified me on that, not to say soccer, but to say football, because American football is a very different thing. But I would use an analogy from cricket or football or rugby or something that you could relate to, or tennis, which is more universal, or nature. I just used the rose. Like if I say, let's plant the seed for an idea, see what grows, let's go out on a limb and give it a chance and see what bears fruit. I just use like 4 or 5 different tree related metaphors. And regardless of what kind of tree you're picturing in your mind, you've seen the tree, I've seen the tree, we're both connecting over that metaphor. So that's one of the keys to metaphor, because I teach at NYU and a lot of my students are international students, many of them females from China. So if I'm talking to a 25-year-old or 28-year-old female from Beijing, a baseball analogy is not going to resonate. I need to speak a language that's either universal or one that resonates specifically. That's why know your audience is so key to being an effective presenter, because that'll help you know which stories will hit their target, which metaphors will land with that person.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's always starting with the audience. It has to be relevant. And I agree with you. It can be so powerful when you use a metaphor or an analogy or a story, as long as it's relevant to the message you want to communicate and relate it to the audience you are communicating to. Especially if you need to communicate something that the audience is not yet familiar with. It could be a technical concept or even whatever idea you have. If they don't understand it yet, when you make that connection by using an analogy or a metaphor or something like that, that's when learning happens. There is one, I don't know what you think about it, Neil deGrasse Tyson in the US. I think he's a great science communicator. And I think that the reason why he's such a great communicator is because he uses analogies all the time, all the time.
Yeah, he takes the complexity of the universe and simplifies it. And that's a key point. It's not dumbing it down. It's not stripping of its nuance and subtlety, but it's simplifying it. Einstein, I love the quote from Einstein that he says, make things as simple as possible, but no simpler. Right? So you want to simplify something without stripping its essence. But that's a great example. I'm a big Neil deGrasse Tyson fan. And I live not far from the Museum of Natural History in New York and the New York Planetarium. So I've seen him a couple of times. But yeah, he does a great job of taking really complicated topics and making it not only simple to understand, but it lights a fire. One of the sayings that I picked up years ago is that as a leader, you need to don't light a fire under people, light a fire within them, right? So you could get someone to do something by threats or force or deception, but if you light a fire within them, you don't have to even motivate them. They're going to be self-motivated, right? So in Good to Great, Jim Collins says, don't discipline people, hire self-disciplined people. Same thing. You hire someone, you get that little spark, but then you help set that person up for success so that that spark gets ignited in them and the passion is allowed to come through.
Yeah, by the way,
yeah.
I have it. Yeah, and then you do. I have it there. Good to Great, amazing book, isn't it? Also in your world, leadership. What a book.
That's a classic. As you can see from the shelves behind me, I have many books. And I mentioned before my obsession with Shakespeare. When I got obsessed with business books many years ago, I was working for a training company. And I started reading them because I had to. And because I had so many horrible bosses in my life, I got obsessed with reading about management and leadership to find out how do you manage and lead people in a way that's effective. And I started reading one a day, one or two or three a week, and over 20 years, from 1998 to 2018, I read over 1,000 business books, management, leadership related books, some communication, presentation, etc. So, after reading all those books, people started saying to me, "When are you going to write your own book?" So that's, but can I give you one real life business example, a real life example of how the power of metaphor really changed things? One of my clients, they had about 20 business development sales reps who were going out in the field, and some were very successful, others were completely not successful. So we did a session, and one of the exercises I did was that we put up, each person got a flip chart on the wall, and they had to draw a metaphor or just sketch out visually, what do they say to the clients when they're behind the scenes, behind closed doors, what are they saying to them to explain the company's products and services? And they had to present it to the group as if we were all the client. And what we found, to the CEO's horror, was that people were explaining things completely wrong, using wrong metaphors that were not even not only not good ones, but not accurate, and actually were the opposite of what they were supposed to be explaining. So that could have been why they weren't selling too much product. So without doing that, without explaining it visually, that we wouldn't have known that. The CEO wouldn't have known that. So through doing that, we basically came up with here are 3 approved metaphors that really illustrate what we do. Now you can tell whatever story you want from your own personal life to illustrate it, but stick to this metaphor because this is the best one to explain what we do. And that dramatically increased sales and morale and people's confidence. So that was a real life example. So it is not just theoretical what we're talking about. It really has practical business applications.
Yeah. And not only is that a great example for the power of metaphors, but also going back to what you said earlier, Todd. And this is something that, as you mentioned, Gar and Nancy say, this idea of planning analog. And you also say that it's much, much better. Now, let's think about presentations because it's our world here. Right. Much better if you need to plan a presentation instead of just opening up PowerPoint or any other presentation tool. If instead you draw something, or if you're planning by using a flip chart, as you did in that session, or using a whiteboard, or you also talk about the power of napkins.
Yes.
It's so planning analog is, if you forget the technology at this stage, is so powerful. Again, why is that? I don't know whether you have a scientific explanation or just based on your experience, but what is it about an analog approach that makes it so impactful?
What it allows you to do, again, not even scientific, but just a reality, you have all these ideas in your head. Life is complex and overwhelming and messy. When you get it, one of my mantras is, how do you get people to see what you're saying? That's the foundation of visual leadership, right? How do you get others to see what you're saying if you can't even see what you're saying for yourself, right? So one of the ways to do that, if you could kind of do data dump, a brain dump of what's in your head, get it on paper in any format, index cards, Post-it notes, pen and paper. Then you could see it. Then you could say, so what I usually do is get all these ideas out of my head when I'm designing a workshop or a presentation. Then I look at it. Then you can move the pieces around. Then you can say, all right, here's some ideas. What's the right sequence and structure? So one is using mind mapping, right? You start with a central idea and then build out from there and in different directions. And you may say, based on the constraints of how much time I have, who's my audience, what's my purpose? And I'll talk about my three-legged stool model in just a minute because those are some of the key components. Then you could say, all right, based on that, what metaphors should I use? What stories should I tell? And then in terms of the sequence, then doing a storyboard. So if you can mind map your content so that you're doing divergent thinking, you're basically starting with an idea and expanding, that's divergent, going on different directions. Convergent thinking is the next step where you bring it back together and say, of all these things, what am I going to focus on? And then what structure and what's the sequence, right? And there you could lay out a storyboard, and that storyboard becomes the template for your presentation, right? So when you do get to open up your PowerPoint document, you basically have it sketched out on paper. It makes it a lot easier to create the slides. This is a mistake a lot of us make. You come up with an idea, you have it on the PowerPoint slide, and then later on you realize, oh, there's no time, or I'm going to go a different direction. And you spent an hour or two just designing that perfect slide, and then it gets cut doesn't make the final cut, right? And you wasted all that time. So that's why I say, don't invest the time on designing your slides perfectly. Maybe you can repurpose that slide in another presentation in the future. But for right now, you're racing against deadlines and time. That's the most efficient way to do it, is just basically, so I have a flip chart right here. So anytime I need to, just throw it on the floor and get on my hands and knees, I always have my colored markers at hand, my Sharpies or my whiteboard markers, and yeah, just get it out of your head and onto paper, and then you can turn it into a presentation.
Yeah, there are so many benefits. It makes a huge difference. And you're right, it doesn't take, because sometimes people tell us, yeah, but it takes more time. Well, no, really, it depends, because actually once you are 100% clear in terms of really what you want to communicate and how, and as you said, once you have a very clear storyboard, then actually it's just a matter of implementing in the presentation tool of your choice, an idea that you already have in your mind and on paper as well. So it doesn't take longer.
Yeah.
Okay. And yes, then let's talk about your three-legged stool presentation model.
Sure. I can actually hold it up because here's a visual picture of it so people can see it if you're watching the video. So, but I'm going to explain it without even looking at it. So basically, picture a stool with three legs, right? And again, there's a lot of people who use the three-legged stool in different ways, right? So I'm not the first one ever to do it. But when you think about it for your presentation, you have a stool with three legs. The seat of the stool represents the purpose. What is the purpose of your presentation? So I always say, before you attach the leg, start with the seat. What's the why? Someone asked you to deliver a presentation, or you found a need. There's got to be a purpose, right? So that's the seat of the stool, and that's what holds everything together. That's like the hub, or that's like the center point, the centerpiece of your mind map. Sitting on that stool is your audience, right? Whether it's one person, 10 people, or 1,000 people, or 100,000 people, who's sitting on that stool? So those are the two things you need to think about before you start designing and coming up with content. Who's my audience and what's my purpose, right? So am I talking to one person about this, or am I talking to 1,000 people about something else, right? Then the three legs of the stool represent, and just like a stool with only one or two legs, it's going to tip over if you don't focus on all three. The first leg is your content, right? What am I going to include, but also what am I going to leave out? And I often say that's the hardest part, right? We know so much stuff. We have so much we want to share. We're passionate, but if you may only have 5 minutes, or you may have a half hour, an hour, or 60 hours, right? But the time constraint will help to dictate how much you can cover, and then from your wealth of content, how much you can include and what you can include and what you're not going to include, right? So that's where you do your research, you come up with your content. Then the second leg of the stool is kind of what we were just talking about. That's where you take that content and you mind map it out. You just come up with the structure, you storyboard it, you think about what examples am I going to use, what stories am I going to tell, etc., what metaphors. That's the design. So it's content, design, and delivery. The third leg of the stool is actually getting up there and doing it, but that includes your preparation and you're figuring out, is it Zoom or on a stage? Is this in an auditorium, or is this a small, intimate, conference room? I always talk about sometimes a client will contact me and ask me to do like a leadership training, and I always walk them through the who, what, when, where, and why, because that will determine the how, right? Who is it for? what are we training them on, when and where is it, why are you doing it, and together with, when you add all that stuff up, now let's figure out the how, right? So the how, you need to figure out what is the context going to be based on everything that you talked about, audience purpose, content, and design. Then the design leg, the delivery leg of the stool is about your preparation and then ultimately your presentation. And that's everything from how are you going to synchronize with your slides, what technology you're going to use, your body language, all your preparation and practice that leads up to it. So, so that's basically the model, because so many times, again, the power of a framework, a visual framework like that, and it's both a model, a metaphor and a framework, is it helps you to simplify the complex. Like, I'm sure the viewers can, and listeners can picture that stool in your mind and say, all right, it's almost like a checklist. Let's start here and then work our way through the 3 legs and see, do any of these legs, is it a little wobbly, the stool? Maybe I need to focus more on one thing than another. So some people are like, oh, I'm really good with the delivery and I need help with the design. Other people will say, you know, I'm struggling here. So I think that's, you know, it's just a way of framing, a framework for really thinking through how are you going to deliver your message to your audience.
Yeah, no, and I agree 100%. These are the 3 key, the legs, the 3 key ingredients, your message, your visuals, if you need them, and your delivery. But absolutely, everything has to be in support of your objective and even more importantly, the audience you are trying to reach. And the key here, and I like the metaphor and the analogy here, is that if one of these 3 key elements is missing, it's like a stool with 3 legs. If one leg is broken, it falls over.
Exactly.
And the same is true with presentations. Absolutely. Okay, so then now, so far, Todd, we've been talking about visual thinking, visual communication, why it's important for effective communication. And so then my question is, what about leadership? What does that have to do with leadership? What does it mean? Because you wrote a book, great book, I recommend it to everybody, Visual Leadership. What's the link? What does it mean to be a visual leader?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so the title of the book, Visual Leadership, it's a single word with a single shared L, right? And I actually got a US patent trademark on the word visual leadership. The word is two things. One, it's a brand, and it's the title of my book. But the other is a concept. It's a concept that it represents the fact that who you are as a leader is inseparable from the lens through which you see the world, right? So our lens through which we see the world, our paradigm, basically, and there's a great book by Joel Barker called Paradigms. A lot of times paradigms, people talk about a paradigm shift. It's kind of become a cliche. But if you think about it, a paradigm is basically a model or a framework or the lens through which you see the world. How we see the world is based on our upbringing, our culture, our parents, our schooling, all of those things, right? So how you lead is inseparable from how you view the world. So if you change the way you see the world, you're going to change the way you lead. So that's the foundation of visual leadership. The other component, and this relates back to the Martin Luther King story that we were just talking about, is as a leader, when I say the word leadership, and I ask my students or my clients in my workshops, you know, what's the first word that comes to mind when you hear the word leadership? Vision is always, if not the first, it's always one of the first 2 or 3, right?
In your TEDx talk, that's what they say as well.
Yeah, yes, exactly. People yell out vision. One of them was my wife, so she had the right answer. But a number of other people did as well. But what does it mean to have a leadership vision? What does it mean to be a visionary leader, like a Martin Luther King, a Richard Branson, an Elon Musk, right, a Steve Jobs, right? You have a picture in your mind's eye of something in the future that doesn't exist or something that could be better. And there's 2 parts to it. One, it's formulating that vision. The other, it's communicating that vision. So if you can, there's a great quote. I actually just wrote this down recently by Bernard Baruch. He wrote, "The ability to express an idea is as important as the idea itself." And I love that. I love that quote. Because you can have a great idea, but if you can't communicate it, people are not going to get it, and it's just going to die on the vine, to use a metaphor, right? So that's the power of visual leadership. It's about how are you seeing things, how are you going to make your vision a reality through and with other people. But also, there's another component to it that I don't talk about in the book because it really didn't resonate with me until more recently. The eye on the cover of the book, first of all, it's a rainbow, and the rainbow represents diversity in all its forms, diversity and inclusion. So originally I had a blue eye because my company is called BigBlueGumball, so I had a blue eye. But then I realized that the blue eye is not, it's kind of a, you know, it's not really inclusive, right? I don't even have blue eyes, but even though it was thematically made sense, the rainbow eye made so much more sense because it's all the colors of the rainbow. So even though no one in the world has an eye that looks like this, it represents all of us. So a couple of concepts. One, it's the idea of flipping the eye, turning that eye. Visual leadership tends to be about outward looking, but flipping the eye means look inward at yourself. Look at who you are and how you are as a leader and as a person. Question your belief systems. The other thing is, can you look at the world and look at things through the lens and from the perspective of other people who are not like you, who are different from you, with empathy, with compassion. I think that's such an important theme these days with social issues, with the pandemic, with the economy, environmental issues. Can you get out of your own head and your own lens and see things from the perspective of other people? As a leader, there's few things that are more important than that. So those are some of the concepts, and that's how the metaphor of visual leadership can be used in a variety of different ways.
Absolutely, and so important. And I can see the strong connection between visual communication and leadership as well. Can I go back to one thing or a couple of things that I found on your book, which
Sure.
I would love our listeners to learn? One is, I think it was a chapter, and the title of that chapter I have it here was "The Pizza Slice Approach to Difficult Conversations."
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us more about it?
Sure. Basically what I did was, and it's so simple, it's not even that complicated. You know, picture a pizza slice, it looks like a triangle or a pyramid, right? So an org chart, an organizational chart for a company, CEO on top and below, and it's like a pyramid. So basically, if you overlay an org chart onto a pizza slice, and each person or each role is let's say a pepperoni, right, on that pizza slice, then you could visualize on that slice who are the people in your world, right? And I always use the I, impact and influence. Who are the people in order to get things done? Who do you need to influence to get things done? And who are the people who will be impacted by any decisions you make or actions you take? Similarly, who are the people who, when they need to get things done, need to influence you, and who are the people who, when they make a decision or take an action, have an impact on you and your work and your life? So the idea behind the pizza slice is basically to visualize that triangle of a slice and then overlay your org chart on it, and then picture who's in your circle of influence. And so that's basically the idea behind it. It just makes it fun. And I also do another workshop where I have three models. One is a 4-box matrix, one is a circle, and one is a triangle. And I basically deliver it in a pizza box. So in a pizza box fold-out handout, where the square one is the box, the round one is the pie, and then the triangular one is the slice. So people leave there with three models, each one representing, you know. So again, it's fun, it's creative, and it's memorable for people, because it's like people won't forget that. People won't forget.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's tangible. So there's the 4 learning styles. VARC. Have you heard that term? VARC: visual, auditory, reading and writing, and kinesthetic. Right. So what they found is that it's not that each person only has one of those 4. It's the fact that if you could leverage all 4 of those sensory modalities, you're going to hit your target. Right. So if you use visuals, slides or imagery or drawing, auditory is spoken. Reading and writing is getting people to actually write things down, and through the act of doing that, they're engaged. And kinesthetic, through movement and doing, people learn, right? Yeah. So if you could deliver a presentation or deliver a training that leverages all 4 of those components, you're gonna engage all of the senses as opposed to just the auditory or just the visual.
Yeah, and that's key. That's so important in our world. Presentations, public speaking, often we just touch one of the audience's senses, and even badly, because it's maybe sight, but actually what they see is just some text and it doesn't work. Actually, we've got 5 senses, so we really need to be able to create multi-sensory experiences, touching more than just one sense. And if
I don't know how you incorporate smell over Zoom, so someone needs to come up with that. But the others you could definitely do, because my NYU class starts in 2 weeks, and we're doing it because of the pandemic, doing it by Zoom instead of live and in person. And so, but we need to replicate that experience as much as we can, despite the fact that we're doing this on Zoom. And that's a challenge we're all facing, right, as presenters right now, is how do you replicate the visceral learning experience and connect with people on a human level when you're not physically in the same room at the same time. So,
of course. And actually, on that point, Todd, is there anything in particular there, based on your experience in the last few months, that you do to try and replicate that experience in the best possible way for your audience when you need to give either an online presentation or maybe an online training course or a workshop?
Yeah, again, a lot depends on, again, the context, the situation, and basically the number of people, right? I did a webinar recently that had 1,500 people globally, 1,500 people. You can't go around and say, all right, everyone introduce themselves. You know, Andrea, tell us about yourself, right? You're not going to do that. If you had 6 people, you might do something like that, right? So you need to think about, also, they were not on screen. So they didn't have their, so they had mics off, cameras off, right? So how do you engage people? One of the things I did was, I happened to be on visual leadership. So I started with, you know, visual thinking. Today's talking about visual thinking. What is visual thinking? In the chat box, type your best definition of visual thinking. So right there, people are engaged and they're typing. Using the whiteboard is a way, using polls, right? So there's ways to engage people in the process so they're not just passive listeners, but active participants. Now, if you have fewer people, then you can really engage people. You could put people in breakout groups and you could pose a question and put them in a group of 3 or 5 and then bring them back, right? So that's what I would say, is try to engage people as much as you possibly can within the constraints of the time limit, the technology, and the number of people that are in attendance.
Absolutely, yeah, this is super important. And I think now it's even more important because online, it's even harder to keep the attention high. And so I think in a face-to-face presentation, I would say at the very least, even if it's an online course, not an online course, sorry, a training class in a university, it doesn't have to be a presentation, but at the very least, every 10 minutes, we should change something. We should do something that brings the attention back. And I think in an online environment, even more than that, maybe every few minutes, 5 minutes max, then we should do something, I think.
Yeah, in addition to teaching at NYU, I do faculty engagement. So I train other faculty members to use experiential learning using my 5 core competencies model of an effective trainer. And one of them is my 5-minute rule. When you start a class, you have to actively have the group doing something within the first 5 minutes, if not sooner. So before it's like, hi, my name is, today I'm going to talk to you about this, launch them right in, give them something to do. It could be a think, write, and share exercise. Think about this, write down your answer, and now share it in the chat box, and now let's talk about it. So you need to engage people. And then in terms of attention span, just like TED Talks are like 6, 12, or 8, no more than 18 minutes, you need to, just like you're saying, you need to have some variety every no more than 18 minutes, maybe 20 at the most, before you shift gears and do something differently. You're dealing with cognitive load, you're dealing with attention span, you're dealing with just people fidgeting in their seats. We need variety. We need to keep it moving and mix it up. Gar Reynolds has a great, even more now than, as much as I love Presentation Zen, his book, The Naked Presenter, is my #1 recommend. When people say, just recommend one book to me to make me a better presenter and communicator, that is my #1 recommendation. And in that book, he has a list of 14 ways of using engagement. And just that one checklist alone, it will help anyone to come up with new ways of gamification. I do things in my NYU class. I immediately throw my students into a pop quiz, a visual quiz where they have to fill in the blanks on famous quotes, and then I put them in the breakout room and they have to share, figure it out together. So before I even introduce the syllabus or what the class is about or anything, they're immediately thrown in. I usually start by saying, all right, I hope you're prepared. We're having a quiz and this counts for 50% of your final grade. And all of a sudden, and I actually use a bell and a buzzer and I make it like a game show. And they know from the very first minute, this class is not going to be like any of their other classes, right? It's fun, it's engaging. And again, not that everything needs to be that way, but that's one of the things that I like to do. But just find a way to do the unexpected, right? People are so bored with boring presentations. You just find a way to be creative. Seth Godin's an amazing presenter. Right there, watch a lot of TED Talks, watch a lot of presentations, and then kind of, quote, borrow and steal some of the techniques that people use. And we've all been in bad, boring ones, and we've all seen, if you're lucky, some really good and great ones. Try to pick up how can you incorporate that into your repertoire as a trainer or as a presenter, so you're not one of the boring ones that people, when people in workshops reflect back on, think about the best and worst presentations you've ever seen. You don't want to be in the worst category.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I've recently interviewed Jackie Berry here in the UK, and she's an expert in, as you mentioned, experiential learning. She's an expert in experiential speaking. So it's all about introducing these moments of interaction during a presentation, also training courses like icebreakers and energizers and gamification, as you mentioned. So super important.
I'm going to have to watch that one. I'll have to watch that one after we get off this one.
Yeah. And just one last thing, maybe a couple of other questions, Todd. There is, so I was reading your book, and then there was a chapter which I loved the title, but then it was really intriguing. But then I said, okay, I'm going to have a conversation with Todd in a couple of days, so I'm not going to read it. And I don't know what the answer will be. I'm just asking you. And the chapter is, I have it here, 2 questions that can forever change your life. I'm just curious, what are these 2 questions?
Yes, I actually got the first question from a refrigerator magnet that I saw in the store and bought to put up on the refrigerator. The question is, if I do, will my future self, and this is the future self question, will my future self thank me for what I am about to do? And my second version of that is, will my future self blame me for what I'm about to do, right? So we always, a lot of times we do things in the moment, or we have we decide and we do something that in the short term seems like a good idea. Like, for example, I love chocolate ice cream, right? In the short term, eating that entire Haagen-Dazs chocolate ice cream seems like a really good idea.
Tell me about it.
But will my future self thank me for that or blame me for that? My present self will thank me because it's delicious, but will my future self most likely blame me? So before, always thinking, that kind of forces you to think about, all right, in the short term, how will I feel? Will I regret it 2 seconds later? Or you may not, but you may regret it a month later or 2 months later, right? I mean, that's one of the ways I lost 35 pounds a couple of years ago by doing that, just before eating that whole ice cream. You know, instead of having the whole thing, just 1 spoonful or something, and say, all right, would I rather have nothing, 1 spoonful, or the whole thing? I'd rather have the whole thing, but my future self is really going to blame me if I gain 5 pounds instead of losing 5 pounds. So that's the question, is, will my future self thank me or blame me for what I am about to do?
I need to do that with, I have a passion which is a bit dangerous, which is craft beer. I love craft beer, and I need to do that. I need to ask myself that question more often.
So it's like, again, it's like modification. Like, one of the things, I had to go work very hard to lose that weight, but then to keep it off, and my wife was a big help with that, it's about modification. So in the past, I would have like a whole pizza and a little salad. Instead, I would have a big salad and 1 slice of pizza, right? You're still getting the pizza, you're still getting the salad, but you're just reversing the proportions. It's almost like the 80-20 rule, and Gar Reynolds talks about that, right? Eat until you're 80% full. I forget the Japanese for that, but that's one of the concepts that he talks about, right? So switch the 80-20 rule and do the 80%, the thing that is better, healthier, and the better choice. And that's with anything. It's like, do I watch this Netflix? Do I binge watch this Netflix series? Or do I get my work done and then reward myself with like a 2-hour movie versus an 80-hour Netflix series, right? Our time is, Peter Drucker, the management guru, said, time is the scarcest resource. If it's not managed, nothing else can be, right? So we need to think about, how am I spending my time? And is what I'm about to spend my time on, is my future self going to thank me for it or blame me for it? So that's the idea behind it. So that's where the visual thinking component comes in, is you actually need to visualize your future self talking to your present self, right? So Todd 6 months from now or a year from now is going to talk to the Todd of today, whatever today's date is, and say, oh, thank you for doing that, or I blame you for doing that, right? That's where the visual part of that comes in.
I love it. I love it. Very powerful. And Todd, before we close, we've been, actually, you already mentioned a few books like The Naked Presenter and Presentation Zen, Nancy Duarte. We've talked about your book, Visual Leadership. Anything else that, if you think about visual communication specifically, is there anything else that comes to your mind in terms of books to read or even other people to follow?
Well, Dave Sibbitt out of San Francisco, he's one of the pioneers. So he has books called Visual Teams, Visual visual teams, visual consulting, visual leaders. So his focus is mainly on graphic facilitation. One of the things about my book, I can't draw. So that's a lot of times, I just want to mention, a lot of times people say, oh, this doesn't apply to me because I can't draw. Drawing is just one element. And first of all, anyone can draw. Like, I'm sure you have the game Pictionary and charades over, right? If you could play Pictionary and charades, you could draw and use body language to communicate visually. If you could draw a stick figure, if you could draw a square, a triangle, and a straight line or a circle, you could draw enough to sketch something out. So I would say eliminate ICD, I can't draw syndrome, from your vocabulary. Because if you ask a group of children how many of you could draw, they all raise their hand, right? But business professionals don't. And it's because we put these constraints that we expect ourselves to be a great artists to draw. You don't have to. It's not about the quality of your drawing. It's about the quality of your idea and your ability to represent it. Dan Rome, wrote the book, The Back of the Napkin. And he's one of the thought leaders in the area of visual communication. So I would say Dan Rome is someone who should be followed. He created this whole visual vocabulary, but just again, it helps to build not only your skills, but your confidence to pick up a pen and draw something out. So when I talk about visual leadership, I break it down to 4 categories. Just this kind of sums everything up. The 4 categories are using pictures, imagery, and drawing. So that whether that's PowerPoint slides or drawing on a flip chart or whiteboard, that's the first category. Category 2 is using mental models and frameworks. We talked less about that today, but it's about putting something like the pizza slice into a grid, into a 4-box matrix, into a pyramid, a step ladder, right? How could you visually represent in a model your idea? Category 3 is the use of metaphor and analogy, which we talked about. And category 4 is the use of visual storytelling and humor. You get extra bonus points if you use humor, because humor resonates. And humor makes people feel good and makes them happy, makes them smile. And if you can make them laugh, all the better. It makes them feel good. That doesn't mean telling jokes. It's important to clarify that. It's not about, hey, 2 people walked into a bar. It's about finding the humor in everyday situations. Like if someone says, you wouldn't believe what happened to me. Your story needs to be authentic, credible, honest, and true. If you make something up, and here's a real story. There was a presenter I really liked. I went to see him live. Amazing storyteller, loved it. And one of the stories he told was, this really happened to me a week ago, and he tells this great story. I went to see him live in person about 3 years later, told the exact same story, saying this true story that's just happened to me last week. It didn't happen to him twice. Now, all he had to say is, this happened to me, right? But what happens as soon as he said, true story, this just happened to me last week, what happened to his credibility in my mind and my respect for him as a person? It just plummeted, right? So don't do that. Don't say anything that is going to make people question your credibility, authenticity. Be true, be authentic, be honest, be real. And that's how you build trust. And bring it full circle back to visual leadership. As a leader, if you don't have people's trust, you don't have anything. And through your stories and through your example and modeling, you want to be a leader that people can trust, because if people trust you, they will follow you. If they don't trust you, they're not following you anywhere. So it's so important to be honest and truthful in the stories you tell and the message you deliver.
Todd, thank you very much. This has been a very enjoyable and useful conversation for me. I've personally learned a lot, also for our listeners. As you said, if I ever come to New York, I'll let you know.
That would be great.
Have a craft beer. I don't know if you like it, or maybe a coffee or something.
All right, that would be great. I'm more of a soda. I'm a New York soda drinker. Diet Coke, Diet Pepsi.
Okay.
I'll buy you a beer if you come to craft beer to New York. Be happy to do that.
And likewise, if you ever happen to be in London, just let me know. And
thank you. If this pandemic ever ends and we could travel again, that'll be great. So
exactly.
But at the very least, we get to meet this way. We probably wouldn't have met if not for the pandemic and for Zoom. So looking at the silver lining, I'm meeting amazing people like yourself. So this has been really great. Thank you for having me with you.
And likewise. Thank you very much, Todd. All the very best. Let's keep in touch.
Thank you, Andrea.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Ideas on Stage podcast, there are many more you might like. So please subscribe, leave us a review, and tell us what you think. You can find many more ideas on business communication at ideasonstage.com, or by searching for Ideas on Stage on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and goodbye for now.